Well, I'm going to try the greeting again. It's great seeing you this morning. It's nice weather. A little cold front has blown through. This is pretty good attendance for the first Sunday of the summer, and I appreciate the way you're kind of scattered out in an even way. We could use 2 or 3 more people in that spot right there. It kind of bugs me, but other than that, we're glad you're here. And we are starting a new sermon series today. In this month of June, I'm calling it the month of the child because we're going to be talking all during the month of June through July the 1st, 5 sermons on childlike faith. We're going to kind of kick that off today, but we'll be talking about the many different ways in which children teach us about faith, in which children teach us about the kingdom of God, which is the primary message that Jesus has in the New Testament. And then on top of that, June is the month of the child because this is Vacation Bible School month. And so we're really gearing up. We want lots of you involved in Vacation Bible School. I'm not preaching the sermon for that reason, but I hope as we preach these sermons, you'll be more and more motivated to say, yeah, I really need to spend some more time around children. That might help a child, but I know it'll help me. That's the way we should think about our precious time with children. And then on July the 1st, Vacation Bible School Sunday, at least I think in the early service in this here and then in the Table of Grace, we'll have Vacation Bible School celebration, and our children from Vacation Bible School will be celebrating with us. But this month, we're going to be talking about childlike faith, the way children teach us about the kingdom of God. And the central message of this comes from Matthew, the 18th chapter. Let me say to you that we find essentially this text in Luke and Mark as well, what we call the synoptic gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John, not a synoptic gospel, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot of material that they share together. And so when we find a story that's in all 3 of those Gospels, we know that it was well known in the early church, certainly authentic in so many, in all the ways you can think about it. We know this happened. So it makes it a little bit more of a powerful and compelling message for us. So we're going to read from the 18th chapter, the first 6 verses. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Now remember, that's what Jesus is always teaching about, the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? They're concerned, of course, about status and stature. They're concerned about who's going to be first, about competition, who's going to be second. Who's greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus does the most unusual thing in the world. He called a little child to him, and he placed the child among them. And he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." That's a pretty radical statement. "Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And if anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me," that's bolded for a reason, we'll talk about it in a moment. "If anyone causes one of these little ones to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Jesus had the habit of saying the most outrageous things in the world. If you ever wonder about this, if you ever start thinking about the Christian story, the New Testament story, and you wonder, well, what was it that Jesus did that made them so angry? What was it that Jesus did that caused them to want to kill him, want to crucify him? All you have to do is stop and think about the outrageous things that Jesus said, the many ways in which he offended them. Things that by their standards and mostly by our standards as well simply don't make sense. So for instance, he said, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you that if anyone strikes you on one cheek, you should turn the other cheek, turn the other way." Not only is it counterintuitive, but it runs against every instinct that we have. I don't know very many people who could even physically do it. He said, if someone comes along, a soldier, and commands you that you give them their coat, go ahead and give them your cloak as well. Honestly, I don't know the difference between a coat and a cloak. I should have done a little bit more research on this passage. But I understand the point that Jesus is making. He says, look, if somebody comes along and tells you to give them your coat, go ahead and give them the coat and then take the shirt off your back as well. Give them everything. About as countercultural as you can get, isn't it? He would say, if someone forces you to go with them a mile, this is a reference to a Roman soldier who would come along, point his spear at you, say, I'm tired. They were required by Roman law to carry the Roman soldier's armor for a mile. He said, if anyone forces you to go a mile, go with them a second mile. How outrageous can you get? And not only that, but Jesus had this tendency to turn all the typical known hierarchies of that society upside down. For instance, he said, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. What kind of sense does that make? He said, the rich shall be poor and the poor shall be rich. Those who make war will find peace, and those who, well, I got it all mixed up there, but you know what I'm trying to say. He had a tendency of turning all these hierarchies upside down. And so here he is in the midst of the disciples. We're not really clear. I'm not really clear exactly who was there, but this we know. The disciples were there, and as was oftentimes the case, Jesus had a tendency to draw huge crowds. So we're guessing that the disciples were there and that there were a lot of other people who had gathered around, and probably on the outside of the circle were the ones who were keeping an eye on this rebellious man named Jesus. Probably the scribes and the Sadducees and the Pharisees and maybe even a few Romans, those who represented the power structure of the society in which Jesus lived. And someone says, who will be the greatest in the kingdom of God? And Jesus takes a child and says, this one shall be the greatest in the kingdom of God. Mind you that this is in a society which devalued women and children in a way that's difficult for us to understand. In that society, both the Roman and Jewish culture, women and children were simply not valued very much. And so when we talk about making a countercultural statement, when we talk about turning hierarchies upside down, he couldn't have made a stronger statement than to take this child and say, this is the greatest among you. You see, he was surrounded by Sadducees and Pharisees and Romans and soldiers and scribes who believed that they were the greatest among them. One of the ways, I guess, to think about this is, what if I were up here teaching you about the kingdom of God? I did a sermon series a few years ago about the kingdom of God. It was well received. This is the central message of the New Testament. So I'm teaching about the kingdom of God. And all of a sudden, I bring a little bit, relatively well educated and some experience. That's a nice way of saying I've grown old. So here I am with education and experience, a certain amount of competence, and I'm teaching about the kingdom of God, and all of a sudden the doors back there fly open, and a young man comes in, 30 years old, and he starts shouting me down, and he says, no, no, no. If you want to know about the kingdom of God, get out of here, go upstairs, and spend some time with the 2- and 3-year-olds. And he would be right. And he would be right. Because Jesus said, the greatest amongst us are these children. I think the key to understanding this passage, we'll put it up here, you saw it was bolded a minute ago. The key to understanding this passage, that's not the right thing, there we go, is this little phrase in verse 6. I have to tell you, I have read this so many times, and I've preached on it so many times. It was only this time that I've noticed this little phrase. He's brought this child into their midst, and he says, these little ones, those who believe in me. Those who believe in me. What Jesus was a saying is that children instinctively believe in God. We know this from our research. You can go ahead and put that, you want to put that Lisa Miller slide up there again? There it is. We know this from our research, a spiritual child. Lisa Miller, my good friend, she's been here a couple of years ago. She's done the research. We know that children are naturally spiritual. You can read her book. We're going to have another program where one of her disciples, a member of our church, will be teaching about the spiritual child. But honestly, you don't have to read the research. All you have to do is spend some time around a child. Walk with your child or grandchild out into the backyard and find a dead lizard or a dead bunny. We found one in our yard the other day. And see what your child says about it. Your child will naturally, instinctively go to the spiritual issues. What happened to him? Where will he go? Is he important to God? I have to tell you, I said this at the last service, I didn't mean to. I get a big kick out of parents who say, well, we don't want to take our children to church, or we don't want to take them to church too early because we don't want to influence, we don't want to prejudice them about religion. I say, give me a break. Your children are already spiritual. If you have a child who is a gifted artist, wouldn't you encourage that in that child? If you have a child, you put him out in the soccer field and he runs circles around everybody else, you would encourage that athleticism. If you have a child, every time you give her a book, she sits there and she can read and read and read. We encourage the gifts in our children. All of our children have the gift of spirituality. And how we cheat them. How we cheat them out of their potential when we don't expose them to the things of God. Oh, I don't want to prejudice my child. Yes, you do. Jesus tells us, look at this child. This child already loves me. This child naturally loves God. So maybe you know where this is going. We start out in life loving God, but as we grow older, we learn to love other things. As we grow older, we learn to love social status. As we grow older, we learn to love money and material things. As we grow older, we learn to love power and influence. As we grow older, we learn to love all sorts of things that are other than God. I don't know about you, I'll just be autobiographical. It is a struggle for me every single day. Every single day of my life, it is a struggle for me to love God more than I love money. I struggle every single day to love God more than I love status and influence. I struggle every day to love God more than I love power. And every now and then I just have to leave my office and walk around this building and into the preschool and spend some time with the 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds just to be reminded about what it means to love God in a pure way, to participate in a pure way in the kingdom of God.